The Secret War against Germania and its historical roots. It is not difficult to see that Germany has a special role on the world stage. In many respects, Germany has played a formative role both in the past and the present. In official historiography, Germany is the personification of evil, so to speak, and although this is a negative description, it plays one of the most important roles in this narrative. The villain is essential for a good story. However, there is much to suggest that the exact opposite is true and that our view of history has been completely turned upside down. In the present, the Germans shine above all with their dubious ability to radically deny themselves and their own interests and borders. Germany's economic power and innovative performance is still enormous despite all adversity, and the entire construct of the European Union is primarily designed to drain this performance out of Germany, so that the country cannot reach its potential. The political and legal construct in which Germany is embedded serves to suppress the German spirit. Most of the foundations for this were laid directly after the Second World War. To understand what happened to Germany in the 20th century, we need to go back in time, starting with the Vatican. The Great Forgery Operation of the Jesuit Vatican. The war against the Germans has its roots, as far as written documents are concerned, in the conflict between the Jesuit Vatican and Protestant Germany. The Eastern German chronology critic Wilhelm Kamier was convinced that the original documents of Germanic history had been destroyed and replaced by forged documents of Gallic Roman history during the 15th-18th century. The following quotations are taken from his book The Forgery of German History. Indeed, according to the result of the Sthamer examination, East Hamer, we can open the imperial charters wherever we want, everywhere, from Franconian time down to the 15th century. It becomes clear that behind data the month dated after actum and the location information into the completed original is artificially and retroactively inserted. Often the words data and actum were themselves added retroactively, as well as different numerical data of the annual characteristics. Page 111 and 112. From the historians you will hear that the testimonies for the existence of a papal archive, that is, a collection of all the curious letters, deeds, registers, files, etc., in the designated rooms carefully preserved, already date back to the 5th century, and that since the times of Innocent I, the popes themselves have relied on their archives for their decisions. The worldly princes and kings, on the other hand, as historical research has instructed us, has not taken the slightest steps to ensure the preservation of their documents and files in any way. So while the rulers did not make any effort to write anything down at all, until the beginning of the modern age, the Church allegedly has a complete documentation of history up to the 5th century AD. This shows that the Church has forged, most likely retroactively, all documents up to modern times. The secret archives. This is also supported by the fact that, according to the Vatican's own statement, hardly any original documents older than 600 years are kept in the secret Vatican library. Most of the documents even date back to modern times. The official reason is that the library was destroyed or looted at regular intervals. Only in 1612 was a central library even started to be established. Before that it was supposed to be a loose collection, which was kept in many different places. Thus Maria Luisa Ambrosini describes in The Secret Archives of the Vatican, 1969, what turbulent developments the Vatican Library has gone through. According to this, the archives of the Church were kept in at least 3 different places until the 11th century, the Lateran, St. Peter's and the Palatine Palace. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, however, a large part of these archives disappeared. When the popes moved to Avignon in the 14th century, the process of transporting their archives took a total of 20 years. The various places where the archives were kept along the route were looted 3 times, 1314, 1319 and 1320. The Western Schism led to the establishment of several papal archives. The different archives of the rival papal claimants were not fully reunited until 1784 in the archives of the Vatican. During the plundering of the Vatican in 1404, papal registers and historical documents were thrown into the streets and Pope Innocent VII fled the city. His successor, Pope Gregory XII, is said to have sold a large number of documents in 1406, including some of the papal registers. Napoleon and the Vatican looting. Due to Napoleon's conquest of the Vatican state, the entire papal archive was moved to Paris. In the course of this move, there was also a massive loss of documents. The insufficient financing of the retrieval operation after Napoleon's defeat led to further losses, and one scholar of the time estimates that up to a third of the archival material that went to Paris never returned to the Vatican. From controlling the archives, the requisition, removal, and return of the Vatican archives during the age of Napoleon. Forgery operation of the greatest effort. We are told that the popes resided in different places, and when they traveled for diplomatic or other reasons, they naturally took all their archives with them, since they needed them for administrative work. Judging by the official history, it is almost a miracle that the Vatican Library still exists. It is more likely that the alleged looting before the 17th century is pure invention, and that before 1612, when the library was officially founded, there had been no archives at all. Camille continues, but if it should be true and real, that almost through all the centuries of the Middle Ages, kings and emperors did not keep any registers and documents, then we are faced with the extraordinary fact that whole generations of a certain class of people did not become a bit wiser by a single degree. For a long time, one would have to accept, as I said, that the all-medieval secular princes were childish clunks, not to say half idiots. However, this is extremely unlikely, because Camille was also able to prove that almost all church documents show signs of forgery. The fact that forged documents with a peculiar chronological corruption and all the other peculiarities described above have been encountered throughout all the centuries of the Middle Ages in connection with the similarity of these forgeries requires the assumption of a late medieval scholarly forgery of the greatest order and effort. Page 120. The proof shows itself to us, again and again, from our knowledge of the similarity of the forged documents. This is due to the production method of the examined pieces, to the absolutely identical and absolutely impossible psyche of the writers behind these pieces, to the strange coincidence regarding the loss of almost all originals and common originals, and finally to the existence of the forged papal registers in connection with the complete lack of worldly registers and archives. Page 239. The counterfeit wave of the universal forgery event strikes backwards in time not only to the times of the Carolingians, Merovingians, but also to the times of Caesar and Tacitus. The systematic counterfeit order reached as far as to the rewriting of the works about ancient Germania. Faking Roman architecture history. The forgery operation of the Latin Papal States is being echoed by the absence of any evidence of medieval architecture in Italy. Viscount James Bryce writes in The Holy Roman Empire, 1864. The modern traveler, after his first few days in Rome, when he has looked out upon the Campagna from the summit of St. Peter's, paced the chilly corridors of the Vatican, and mused under the echoing dome of the Pantheon, when he has passed in review the monuments of regal and republican and papal Rome, begins to seek for some relics of the 1200 years that lie between Constantine and Pope Julius II. Where, he asks, is the Rome of the Middle Ages, the Rome of Alberic and Hildebrand and Rienzi? The Rome which dug the graves of so many Teutonic hosts, whither the pilgrims flocked, whence came the commands at which kings bowed? Where are the memorials of the brightest age of Christian architecture, the age which reared Cologne and Reims and Westminster, which gave to Italy the cathedrals of Tuscany and the wave-washed palaces of Venice? To this question there is no answer. Rome, the mother of the arts, has scarcely a building to commemorate those times. The forgery of ancient Germanic history. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, Sacrum Imperium Romanum Nationis Germanici. This Roman Empire existed until 1806, and its roots supposedly go back 1,000 years. The question arises whether the German Roman Empire, also called the Old Empire, really emerged from the ancient Roman Empire. Or was the allegedly Italian Latin Roman Empire only an invention of the Vatican to legitimize the claim to power over Europe? Was the southern Europe of the ancient past simply a part of some kind of unified Roman Empire, whatever Roman means in this context? And what if this unified Roman Empire suffered from fragmentation in the course of time, so that a part of the old empire split off under German rule, and one under papal rule? The unified Roman Empire. The German sociologist Gunnar Heinzen
argues that historical events that spread across antiquity and the early Middle Ages did indeed all happen simultaneously. In other words, the Western Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, and the Germanic Roman Empire must be seen as parts of a single unified civilization that, in my estimation, collapsed about 500 years ago after a worldwide cataclysmic event. This event, possibly a natural catastrophe, triggered a fondness for apocalyptic cults of salvation recorded in the biblical apocalypse, among others. The Russian scientist and chronology critic Anatoly Fomenko states that the Book of Revelation was written shortly after October 1, 1486, according to the constellation of stars encoded in the verses. The apocalypse, or the end of the world, was then predicted for the year 1492 AD, exactly 7,000 years after the creation in 5508 BC, according to the Byzantine calendar. Most of the illustrations from the apocalypse date from this time of the 16th century, for example by Albrecht Dürer. Coincidentally, the year 1492 is mainly associated with one historical event, the discovery of America. Is this a deliberately chosen date, i.e. the symbolic destruction of the Old World and the beginning of the New World? The Book of Revelation was most likely written by a German author, Johannes Reuchlin. Old World architecture. As it turns out, there were many remnants here in Germany that, according to modern history, can only exist in Rome. Now it becomes understandable why German culture and architecture was almost completely destroyed in the First and Second World War. The true history of Germany was revealed in architecture. Germany was not a country of dirty barbarians living in forests. In fact, Germany is a part of the world's pre-flood culture, and the architecture destroyed in the world wars was the living proof of our origins. This is why the wars were so traumatic, because they separated us from our origins. Next to literature, architecture is the strongest link between the present and the past. Tacitus Germania. Most likely, the book Germania, by Tacitus, was written sometime between the 15th and 18th century by Vatican forgers in the Corvey Monastery. The old and true history of Germany cannot be reconstructed because all previous documents were destroyed and replaced by forgeries. Germania was one of the first propaganda works of the Vatican, with the aim to portray the Germans as primitive savages. Due to the burning of books and the persecution of witches by the Papal Inquisition, this forgery work by Tacitus, most likely produced in the Renaissance and subsequently backdated, is today almost the only historical document on which the Germans base their Germanic understanding of history. Basically, all historical sources about old Germany come from the pen of the Vatican and its counterfeiting workshops in the Renaissance. The author Uwe Topper also assumes this. Tacitus Germania is not 2,000 years old, but was produced by the Vatican about 300 to 400 years ago to rewrite the history of Germany after the 30 Years' War to bring down the counterpart of the old unified Roman Empire. The original documents of German history were all destroyed. Germania Magna. The Germania Magna, officially the name of the settlement area of the Germanic tribes, which had been occupied by the Romans for a long time, described in the questionable ancient Latin sources, for example in Ptolemy's Geographia Hyphagesis, was transported far into the past, as was the entire European history. But in fact, the Great Germania did not exist only 2,000 years ago as officially claimed, but still 400 years ago, because the so-called Roman Empire of the German nation was the ancient Germania. The German history of the last 400 years since the 30 Years' War can be understood as the gradual destruction of Germania Magna, Latin for Great Germania. The old Germania probably included geographical areas of Switzerland and the Netherlands, as well as today's Denmark, Austria-Hungary, France and parts of Eastern Europe. The historian Holger Kalwait claims that there is still a lingering war on Earth, a primeval conflict between the Nordic race, which came from Hyperborea and later lived in Atlantis in the North Sea, on the one hand, and the Hebrews on the other. The Hebrews won the war, destroyed the Nordic culture and rewrote the history of ancient Germania via controlling the Vatican. The linguist Erhard Landmann was convinced that the Bible was probably copied from old German books, the meaning of which was lost quite quickly due to the sloppy translation. This process was intentional and the Latin language was probably created as an artificial language especially for this purpose of the Jesuit culture war against the Germans. The invention of Latin as a forgery tool. Even though Latin is usually associated with ancient texts, this is not true. Even according to the official narrative, only a tiny 0.01% of all Latin texts originate from antiquity, The largest part of 95% was only written after the 14th century and thus originates from the time of the Renaissance, so-called New Latin. It is therefore highly probable that the humanistic forgers of the Vatican invented the Latin language in order to conceal their forgeries from the populace. Not only Neo-Latin literature, but also the allegedly ancient Latin literature, was created in the Renaissance, only artificially taken back in time. Obviously, there is room for the following alternative theory. Latin is a language originating from Dacia. Ancient Dacian did not vanish mysteriously but is the common ancestor of both Latin and modern Romanian. Dacian, if you will, is Vulgar Latin, which preceded Classical Latin. A likely explanation for the fact that Dacia is also called Romania is that it, rather than Italy, was the original home of the Romans who founded Constantinople. That would be consistent with the notion that the Roman language, Latin, remained the administrative language of the Eastern Empire until the 6th century AD, when it was abandoned for Greek, the language spoken by the majority of its subjects. That, in turn, is consistent with the character of Latin itself. The hypothesis that Latin was a non-demotic language, a koine of the empire, a cultural artifact developed for the purpose of writing, was first proposed by Russian researchers Igor Davydenko and Yaroslav Kessler in the Book of Civilizations, 2001. The Bible in Old German. Back to the Old German language, Adam and Eve, for example, in Old German simply means Adam Eva, the eternal man. The part about the apple was also translated incorrectly. There was never an apple, and in Old German the word stem Abel simply means evil. The meaning behind this story is that mankind was thrown out of the paradise state when evil came into the world. And Cain and Abel are not the names of two people. Cain-Abel simply means no evil. Cain equals none, Abel equals evil. The text was probably meant to describe why evil came into the world and why people began to harm each other. The word Catholic also encodes the true meaning. It comes from the Old German word cautelo, the false doctrine, plus the adjective toll, stupid, lost, silly, foolish, as well as the forms tolic and catholic, which literally means the stupid, the misguided, the foolish. Accordingly, it can be deduced what reputation the Catholics enjoyed before their seizure of power. The 30 Years' War. Officially, the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, was a religious war between Catholic and Protestant parties, but it later grew into a territorial war in Central Europe and was largely fought on German soil. On the one hand, the conflict was a religious war between the Catholic League and the Protestant Union and, at the same time, a struggle for supremacy in the Holy Roman Empire between the Habsburg Emperor and several sovereigns in the interior, and between the empire and European opponents such as France, Denmark, and Sweden in the exterior. Although religious antagonisms lost more and more weight, especially at the end of the war, the Reformation that began in 1517 and the accompanying separation of the Protestants from the Catholic Church was one of the most important reasons for the war that later broke out. However, the official interpretation does not explain many obvious contradictions. Why did Germany in particular have to be the center for this war, which caused 1/3 of the German population to lose their lives in famines and bloody battles and devastated the country for decades? Why was the civilian population so much involved in the war? Why, according to official history, were half of all buildings in Germany destroyed during the 30 Years' War? What kind of destructive force had to be unleashed in order to lay an entire country in ruins with the technology of the 17th century? Are we talking about a war with high-tech weapons or about a cataclysm involving earthquakes and floods? This is how people at the time viewed the 30 Years' War. Contemporaries interpreted the war as God's punishment. In late autumn 1618, a huge comet stood in the evening sky. God had announced that he would punish the people for their many sins. These counted one and one together. The war in Bohemia had begun. The climatic change of the Little Ice Age had repeatedly led to famine crises since 1560. and a hyperinflation began around 1620. The simultaneity of war, inflation, and disease or death referred to the revelation of John. The horsemen of the apocalypse got released. The Last Judgment and the end of the world could hardly be stopped. From interpretations of the 30 Years' War, myth, legends, and insights. The official picture of the 30 Years' War stands on shaky legs. Even mainstream research has now come to the point of questioning the old sources. There are no credible original sources on the subject. But for some years now, the horror reports from the 30 Years' War have been undergoing a sharp revision. Friedrich Schiller's description of the downfall of the city of Magdeburg is just as untrue as the description of the Battle of Wittstock by Johann Jacob Christoffel von Grimmelshausen is authentic. His Abenteuerliche Simplicissimus Deutsch was long thought to be the autobiography of its creator and thus one of the few true sources of the time. Grimmelshausen's description of the battle, of all things, much quoted as a vivid document of brutalization, is not based on his own experience and is the result of artistic source processing. I doubt that we know much about the 30 Years' War, except that anything happened that later got the name 30 Years' War. A sound interpretation of the 30 Years' War would begin by taking seriously the fear of the people who were waiting for God's judgment. This means that we must think in categories such as catastrophes, floods, earthquakes, robberies, and political power struggles. What has survived in our history is only a strongly distorted picture of the last and most insignificant part of the most important event of the 17th century, the religious political power struggles between Protestants and Catholics. The historian Edwin Johnson claims that the Bible was written by both Catholics and Lutherans, Protestants, which explains the obvious Protestant influence of parts of the Bible. The Bible is the result of the greatest cultural clash of the 17th and possibly 18th centuries in Central Europe. The Napoleonic Wars were the final chapter of this traumatic conflict. After 1815, this conflict led to a process of political renewal in Europe. One possible area of future research is the question whether Napoleon is a complete fabrication by the history controllers to hide a natural cataclysm or high-tech war during that time. There is zero archaeological evidence of the Napoleonic Wars. The so-called Wars of Reformation also laid the foundation for the destruction of the original Greater German Empire, when the Vatican killed a large part of the German population and destroyed Protestant Germany. The papacy and Catholicism entered the German cultural area from Italy via southern Germany, which is also the reason why the south of Germany is still Catholic today, while the north is predominantly Protestant. Here were the battle lines between the Jesuit Vatican and Protestant Germany. And this conflict was still active when Bismarck led Prussia into the bitter cultural struggle Kulturkampf against the Catholic Church. The annihilation and fragmentation of Protestant Germany led to a failed resistance movement, which historians today refer to as the Pan-Germanic, All-German movement. The two world wars were the final step in eliminating the once great German spirit. The Reformation lie. The Reformation did not happen in the way we are led to believe. In reality, it happened the other way round, i.e. the Catholics were the reformers. The other group were the Protestants who protested against the Catholic changes to the Holy Scriptures. The meaning is in the name. The Bible did not exist before the time of the so-called Reformation. It is a product of the early 17th century and was compiled shortly after the height of the Reformation Wars, which was probably the time of the 30 Years' War. Uwe Topper summarizes the discoveries by chronology critic Edwin Johnson. The Christian Church originated in the Benedictine monasteries of France, Paris, and Lyon. Around 1500, the Catholic Church Fathers were written by incompetent monks, and the New Testament was born as a result of these forgeries. There are no older texts, and the content shows the time, the beginning of the printing press. It follows from Johnson that the Protestants or Reformed were a monastic movement, which can be described as a late form of original Christianity, perhaps 2 generations after the emergence of Christianity itself, which for Johnson cannot have been before the middle of the 15th century, whenever the 15th century really was. The Catholic Church came into being only as a counter-movement to it, on the Tridentum. Here stood the Round Table, which Johnson uses as a term for the Great Forgery event, as the earliest date for trustworthy news from the time of the reawakening of the sciences, the time of the printing press. Johnson mentions the year 1533, although he expresses doubt about his claim, because he does not know exactly when this year is.
He also knows the monasteries of the forgery operation, Monte Cassino and Bobbio, Fulda, Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, Saint Denis and Saint Germains of Paris. even knows some of the actors. The notorious Abbot Tritheim was of course one of them, and does not spare admiration for this achievement, though he does not hide the fact that he considers lies of this magnitude unworthy of our culture, just as he strongly condemns the continuation of these lies by contemporary scholars. p. 91-92.
If Johnson's conclusions are correct, and I see no way to refute them, then our entire written literature and literary culture does not begin until 1460. The recalculated date is correct, he says. But our precious first prints often carry no dates or are arbitrarily dated, usually well in advance. We do not know how old they are. Many manuscripts, especially the Bible texts, are made later, according to printing templates. The work was by no means completed around 1570, but continued throughout the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries with undiminished vigor. In this context, Tischendorf's name, which I have just described as the maker of Codex Sinaiticus, is also mentioned, 2001 ch. 8. In my opinion, the wars of Reformation were the last great bloody conflict between the powers of light and darkness won. After they had eliminated the free German people, Catholics compiled the Bible as the most important documents from the previously freely circulating books, but they changed essential elements. The reason why truth can still be found in the Bible is that the forgers did not have much time, as they had to quickly create a propaganda version of the scriptures to indoctrinate the masses. And, more importantly, the papal Catholics, also had to add true elements to convince people that they were representing the only true religion. The protest against the Vatican united all of Europe, and was decentralized in nature. There were never Protestants, in the sense of a kind of religion, except that various groups of Gnostics and heretics were united in their will to fight against the institution of the Church in Rome. These religious wars were so bloody, because religion was still very young. These so-called Reformation wars were the real, original conflict between free Christians and institutionalized Christianity, and they were so bloody because the knowledge of Jesus and other Bible material was still so fresh historically. People knew their history, they were still connected to the things we can read about in the Bible because it was their own history. So in truth there had been no Reformation at all, because there was nothing to reform. What we know today as the Reformation is only the very last part of this whole cultural process, when the Church had already wiped out the original resistance and the survivors slowly started a modern Reformation of the Church, but that was long after the 30 Years' War. Churchill and the Hanseatic League. There is an esoteric reason why Churchill first bombed the former Hanseatic cities in the north, Hamburg, Bremen, Bremerhaven, Kiel, etc. Virtually no Hanseatic city survived the Second World War. Centuries-old city centers, the hearts of German culture, were completely wiped out in the firestorm of 1943 to 1945. After the 30 Years' War, the original German culture predominantly lived on in the Protestant north, as the south had already been largely disempowered by the Catholics. And indeed, the northern German cities suffered most during the Second World War, with Bremerhaven at the top of the list of destroyed cities. 97% of the entire city center was destroyed by fire bombs. Hamburg also succumbed to fire after the bombing, which was characteristically called Operation Gomorrah. This name clearly contains an occult Hebrew reference. Possibly, this secret reason for the destruction of the German North is also connected with the bombing of the northern island of Heligoland, surprisingly 2 years after the end of the war, and the cession of northeastern areas, to Danzig, Königsberg, East Prussia, with connections to the Hanseatic League.
This is the German island of Heligoland, the Gibraltar of the North Sea. Once a British possession, Heligoland was the key point of Germany's sea power. In World War II, it was Hitler's base for the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boat pens, gun emplacements and underground storage tunnels are due to be blown up by thousands of tons of high explosive. They'll be fired by submarine cables and wireless transmission from the Navy's ships 9 miles away. At the 4th pip of the BBC time signal, Lieutenant Commander Frank Graves of London pushes the button. 7,000 tons of bombs, depth charges and high explosives detonate from within the island. A 12,000-foot-high column of smoke goes up. From the plane, this is the air picture of the explosion.
The flight and expulsion of Germans between 1944 and 1950 is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Second World War, and left millions of Germans dead, and even more traumatized and disrooted. It was a genocide on the Eastern German population and culture. By the way, all major German cities were originally built on star fortresses, starforts. If you go to the east, you can still find German manors and castles in supposedly Slavic Estonia, and many Estonians still speak German. German history has been falsified beyond recognition. It is said that Estonia is influenced by German culture, but it can be assumed that Estonia was German for a long time until the Slavs and Germans mixed. Even after that, when the Germans made up only a small percentage of the Baltic population, they still dominated culturally. Look at the architecture of Tallinn as an example of Hanseatic fame. It has the oldest European pharmacy. And who founded the pharmacy? It was Baltic Germans. Polish ethnographer Professor Jan Bystrom discovered that many Polish names were originally German. Even German noblemen who settled in Poland often allowed their names to be changed. Such processes make the assignment of today's territories to a past culture highly complicated. Vatican, fascism, and the wars of religion. Cardinal Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli, future Pius XII, signs the Reich Concordat on behalf of Pope Pius XI on July 20, 1933. The two world wars must be seen as a strategy of the Vatican to finally win the old conflict between Catholics and Protestants. While the ideology of fascism was partially rooted in noble goals, referring to, for example, revolt against the modern world, politics, religion, and social order in the Kali Yuga by Julius Evola, the movement was itself a force of the Kali Yuga, as all social movements tend to eventually degenerate in the age we are in, no matter the original intentions. Unfortunately, just like communism/socialism, fascism was a psyop by the elites. The plan was to create a clash between socialism and fascism to destroy European and Russian culture and history. Not only so-called progressive, but also conservative movements are controlled by the powers that be, even if they start with good intentions. The ideology of fascism was rooted in the desire to bring back the old order and fight against the cultural degeneration symbolized by democracy, modern politics, atheism, materialism, nihilism, equal rights, Freemasonry-inspired human rights, instead of law of nature, and devolution of both the masculine and female nature. The old order was represented by the monarchies. Kingship was the supreme form of government, and was believed to be in the natural order of things. It did not need physical strength to assert itself, and when it did, it was only sporadically. It imposed itself mainly and irresistibly through the spirit. Julius Evola, Revolt against the Modern World. The turning point where the new order replaced the old was the French Revolution, which had overthrown the old ideals that fascism eventually tried to bring back into the world. And indeed, the usual suspects managed the fascist movement, like the Jesuit and Hebrew-controlled Vatican. The two world wars were part of a long-planned plot to finally annihilate the remnants of Germania, the heart of 17th century Protestantism, originally a conservative movement. Prussia was the last Protestant stronghold, and the Allies celebrated their victory over Protestantism with annihilating Prussia altogether by giving it to Poland. It took a long time until 1990 to finalize this process in the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, and this treaty was still a compromise for the PTB, because they know that the German Reich never officially surrendered, so all laws regarding Germany from 1945 onwards are legally void. Legal constructs are important to the elites, because only with the explicit consent are they allowed to do what they do, otherwise spiritual laws would be violated, which creates a lot of unnecessary karma for them. Now Luther has lost the war. Pope Benedict XV, after the end of the First World War. Adolf Hitler, son of the Catholic Church, died while defending Christianity. Francisco Franco, May 3, 1945. Needless to say, a history of Martin Luther was written by the victors of the Reformation Wars, and we will never know who Luther was, and if he really existed. But in the 20th century, Luther represented Protestantism, so Pope Benedict referred to this century-long war. The first service that the ex-socialist Mussolini rendered to the Holy See was a financial one. In fact, he saved the Banco di Roma, to which the Curia and several of its prelates had entrusted large sums of money, from bankruptcy by stepping in with about 1.5 billion lira at the expense of the Italian state. Since the reorganization of the Banco di Roma, the Italian bishops, including the Pope, began to sing the praises of Mussolini. After Mussolini had reached his goal with the help of the Pope was also to reach his with the help of Mussolini. Francesco Nitti, former professor of finance and former prime minister of the Italian government, said, "But what has the Vatican actually got now? A very small territory, but the recognition as a sovereign state. Moreover, it has received a sum that is unique in the history of the Church, the capital of a world bank." Catholicism became state religion, church marriage became equal to civil marriage, divorce became impossible, religious education became the foundation and crowning glory of public education in all elementary and secondary schools. Anti-church books, newspapers and films were banned, and criticism and insults to Catholicism were made punishable. Yes, the state successfully harmonized all its legislation with canon law. Of all the concordats, treaty between the Holy See and a state that was binding under international law, that Pius XI had concluded until then, with Latvia in 1922, with Bavaria in 1924, with Poland in 1925, with Lithuania in 1927. The concordat with fascist Italy was the most favorable for the Curia. As Francesco Nitti wrote, it extinguished 2 centuries of internal development and abolished the country's spiritual independence. In general, the books of the Italian elementary schools at that time consisted of 1/3 of catechism, instruction in the fundamental questions of the Christian faith, and prayers, and 2/3 of glorifications of fascism and war, which was soon to be provoked. Just as the Vatican in Italy paved the way for the Mussolini dictatorship by eliminating the Catholic Party, so it did in Germany through Franz von Papen, Ludwig Koss and the dissolution of the Zentrum Sparte, the oldest Catholic party in Europe. It gave Hitler unlimited power. In return, he was expected to give the same concessions as Mussolini. This was clearly indicated by the papal nuncio in Berlin, Cesar Orsnigo, who openly rejoiced in Hitler's seizure of power. On January 30th, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of the Reich at Papen's suggestion. Hindenburg had only overcome his reservations because Papen assured him that the actual head of the government would be himself, the Vice-Chancellor. When Koss won his faction's vote for the Enabling Act, he quickly left for Rome. On April 10th, Papen and Hermann Göring appeared at the Vatican, where, as the press reported, they were received with great honor and Pius XI was very impressed by them. The Pope also remarked, writes Papen, how delighted he was to see at the head of the German government a personality who fought uncompromisingly against communism and Russian nihilism in all its forms. On April 20th, on Hitler's birthday, Koss sent sincere blessings and the assurance of unwavering cooperation, and soon the concordat with Hitler's Germany was presented to the amazed world. According to its timing, content, and official episcopal interpretation, the concordat encouraged crimes and criminals, morally defamed every determined opposition, legitimized the National Socialists to count themselves among the state powers on the side of order, and led the Catholic people into the mass grave to secure the Hitler dictatorship. Johannes Fleischer. Pan-Germanism. Were the conflicts that led to World War I related to invisible forces that divided the Germans? How large was the German territory in 1600? And were the people in the German-speaking world somehow politically united? How old was the German Reich really? Did anyone try to prevent the Germans from remaining in unity, which eventually led to all the divisions we see in the 19th century? What role did Austria-Hungary play? What was the true role of the German Confederation after the Congress of Vienna in 1815, and what really happened in the Napoleonic Wars that led to them? Where did the idea of Pan-Germanism, Greater Germany, come from? Were the 2 world wars the last parts of a centuries-long extermination process against the German Reich? Did the Germans really invade the Slavic countries in the East during colonialism, or was it the exact opposite? Did the German Empire once border on Tartary, today Russia? Why, according to mainstream historians, did Pan-Germanism only begin during/after the Napoleonic Wars? Was the centuries-old peace between the kingdoms of Central Europe destroyed by the Napoleonic Wars? Is it possible that there was unity among the peoples without the need for a central government? I suggest that all political structures that existed before Napoleon were in practice a united and greater Germany, and that everything that happened after 1815 was in reality the result of Napoleon's destruction of that unity. Napoleon is a code word for whatever really happened, as Napoleon is most likely a fake and never existed. The German Revolution of 1848 was the nationalists' attempt to restore the old way of life of the German kingdom. Atlantis and the Second World War. The Atlantis researcher Jürgen Spanuth introduced the idea that Atlantis was originally located in the North Sea, with today's Heligoland as the last remnant of the huge island kingdom. According to Spanuth, the Atlanteans were immortalized as Hyperboreans in Greek mythology. Churchill's hatred against the genetic connection of the Germanic tribes with the gods of Hyperborea and Atlantis led to the total destruction of Helgoland. In 1928, Hitler and Goebbels visited the most northern island of Germany. For the National Socialists, the destroyed fortifications stood for Germany's lost global ambitions and the shameful treatment by the Allies. Himmler was obsessed with the idea that these were the visible remains of an Aryan Atlantis, the birthplace of the German race. The complete destruction of Heligoland by the British in 1945 and 1947 was an attack on everything the island symbolized. The goal was to erase the connection to Atlantis from human memory once and for all. German culture and DNA. Excerpt from the book The Myth of German Villainy. The image of Germany as a dark, predatory, warlike nation did not take root until the 20th century. Before that, however, Germany was seen as a place of peace and enlightenment. The highly respected Cambridge historian Herbert Butterfield commented in detail on Britain's high regard for Germany. In England, the view once prevailed that German history was above all a history of freedom, for it was a history that included the German Confederation, parliamentarianism, autonomous cities, Protestantism, and a law of freedom that was carried from the German colonies to the Slavic East. At that time, it was the Latin states that were considered followers of authoritarianism, clinging to the papacy in Italy, the Inquisition in Spain, and the Bonapartist dictatorships in militaristic France. The reversal of this view in the 20th century, and its replacement by the general opinion that Germany had always been the aggressor and enemy of freedom, will undoubtedly one day be the subject of historical research itself, especially since it seems to coincide so closely with a change in British foreign policy. Due to Western colonialism which brought German DNA into the entire world, including Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and America, German DNA is now spread worldwide and people of German descent are still culturally leading in almost all societies today. Almost all important scientific discoveries were made in Germany or by Germans. Until the First World War, Germany was the world leader in technology, research, and science. Today it is Germans who are leading the way in establishing the technocratic world order with their knowledge in Silicon Valley. Peter Thiel, for example, has German roots. The war against the original Germanic peoples was always a war against the remnants of a particular race, and today the extermination of the white population is the final phase of this war. It took 4 major wars to end the German superiority on the geostrategic chessboard: the 30 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and the First and Second World War. Although the Second World War was the last nail in the coffin for the de facto superiority of Germany in science and technology, the war is not over yet. It is not so much about fighting against a certain country, but against a certain group of people. National Socialism was supposed to destroy Germany from within from the very beginning. The decision to attack Poland over the issue of the Gdansk corridor and the withdrawal from Dunkirk implied that the forces that controlled the National Socialists meant to escalate and then lose the war from the very beginning. The goal was to create a guilt complex in the German population so that Germany would never again be able to connect with its history of old. Violent re-education has created a kind of psychological barrier in the Germans that suppresses any genuine historical awareness of the time before the 20th century. Due to the collective traumatization in the First and especially the Second World War, the Germans are almost completely cut off from their cultural past. Michael Ende and collective memory. One of the few Germans who tried to gain access to the buried collective memories in the post-war period was the famous author Michael Ende. As a child, Michael Ende survived the bombings of Munich and Hamburg. He survived what millions of Germans did not survive, and those who survived it could never speak afterwards about the horrors they had experienced. So the German war trauma was suppressed, and this has shaped the post-war period politically and culturally, and still influences our collective actions. The suffering experienced was passed on to future generations, unconsciously, and we still carry it within us.
Wer bist du?
Mein Name ist Momo.
At the age of 12, Michael Ende experienced the first bombing attack on Munich. Our street was completely in flames. The sound that was produced was not a crackling, it was a kind of howling. The fire howled. I remember running through the burning street like a drunkard and singing. It was an euphoria that captured me. I still can't quite explain it to myself today. I almost jumped into the fire like a mosquito flying into the light. To the firestorm, which razed half of Hamburg to the ground, he later said, "That really was the end of the world. It always comes back to my dreams of how we recovered the braised corpses that were purred to baby size. I still see before me today the army of distraught people who wandered through the ruins like in a labyrinth. One of them was carrying a table on his back, probably the only thing he could save." In the post-war period, Ende returned to Munich and witnessed drunken American soldiers shooting at civilians for fun. In this experience is crystallized the collective helplessness that affected almost every German in the post-war period in one way or another, be it through the hunger winter of 1946, or the mass rapes by the occupying forces. His war experiences have left their mark on Michael Ende. In his works there are coded references to the fact that he tried to bring the German war trauma into the collective awareness and to heal it. His aim was to make the unconscious conscious through literature. Perhaps I will create something that the Greeks called catharsis. A knot will loosen and then people will feel healthier. With my work I am trying to do something very similar to the work of medieval alchemists or storytellers, namely to translate the phenomena of the outer world into the signs of the inner world. Michael Ende moves to Italy in 1970. The architecture of Rome and the Italian attitude to life remind him of pre-war Munich, and he feels at home for the first time. In Italy he writes Momo, and in this book he criticizes not only the monetary system but also the superficial German culture, which has forgotten how to enjoy life in real ease. Later he writes the never-ending story, in which a mysterious nothing swallows the world Fantasia, ever larger parts of the right called Fantasia disappear, and people dissolve as well. Quote from the book, "The nothing is spreading, groaned the first. It's growing and growing, there's more of it every day, yet it's possible to speak of more nothing. All the others fled from howling forest in time, but we didn't want to leave our home. The nothing caught us in our sleep and this is what it did to us." "Is it very painful?" Atreyu asked. "No," said the second bark troll, "the one with a hole in his chest. You don't feel a thing. There's just something missing. And once it gets hold of you, something more is missing every day. Soon there won't be anything left of us." The bombing of Hamburg seems to be present here in encrypted form, and the destruction of Fantasia is reminiscent of the sudden and almost complete destruction of German culture in the firestorms of World War II between 1943 and 1945. The work of Michael Ende can be considered shamanic. His own life was a constant struggle to gain access to something true and real, and he has written about this process in his books. In this way, he has also touched the souls of millions of Germans, even though his attempt to create more awareness was not successful. He lived through the hero's journey, described by Joseph Campbell in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. But the Germans were not really prepared to understand the deeper message of his works. The way to a better future is to integrate the past. The traumatic experiences of the war ensured that the German people split off a large part of their awareness into the suppressed parts of the psyche. And so we Germans have also lost an essential part of our identity and vitality, at least until the painful experiences are allowed to surface again. If this happens, a state of wholeness can be achieved again. Every individual who comes close to the real history does his or her part to lift this veil of collective amnesia. A nation is only able to act when it is deeply rooted in its own history.